Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. I'm so thrilled to be joining all of you for this panel, and it's such a privilege to moderate with this tremendous group of leaders. I'm going to offer a little bit more detailed introduction for each of our panelists, and then we'll dive into a set of really meaty questions to close out what's been a really remarkable day. And this panel represents the opportunity to take the learning that we've all engaged with, where state and local officials, refugee leaders have been leading on welcoming policies, and talk about what that means at the national level. We have a tremendous set of panelists and leaders. First introduction, Congressman Jason Crow. He's a former Army Ranger and lawyer and represents Colorado's 6th Congressional District. Representative Crow has been at the forefront of strengthening our democracy and fighting the influence of money in politics through ethics and campaign finance reform, with an additional focus on preventing gun violence, protecting dreamers, and passing comprehensive immigration reform, and combating the effects of climate change. He's also the Democratic co-sponsor with Republican Representative Katko on the reintroduction of the Opportunities for New Americans Act, which would create a national study on barriers to entry for refugees and immigrants who are skilled professionals, a topic very relevant to the discussion we've had throughout the day. I'm also so pleased to introduce Nancy Izzo-Jackson, who serves as the Senior Bureau Official for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. I'll just do a little translation of bureaucratic terms for everyone on this call to let you know that that means she's the Acting Assistant Secretary, Leadership of the Bureau, and we're so lucky to have her. Ms. Jackson brings deep expertise in refugee policy, having served in many leadership roles in the Bureau, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary overseeing the offices of assistance programs for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, and the policy and resource planning offices. Most recently, Ms. Jackson has served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of South and Central Asia Affairs, where she supported the formulation and execution of U.S. policy toward Afghanistan. And then I'm so pleased to introduce Cindy Huang, who serves as the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Many of you know the work of this agency in partnering with many state and local officials on long-term refugee integration and successful outcomes. She's also been leading the U.S. government Biden administration's response to unaccompanied children and the increase in arrivals at the border. So we're really pleased that she's had time to join us today. Prior to joining the Biden administration, Director Huang was Vice President of Strategic Outreach at Refugees International, and she was the co-founder and first director of the Refugee Advocacy Lab, an initiative with more than 24 partners that has built a diverse constituency for refugees through strategic communications, inclusive policies, new partnerships, and policy advocacy at local, state, and national levels. Okay, so with those introductions, we'll dive into our first question. We have spent the day hearing from refugee, state, and community leaders about the exciting things happening to welcome and support refugees in ways that benefit both refugees and the new communities of which they are a part. That's contrasted with what can often feel like tough and increasingly partisan politics around refugee issues at the national level, despite a long tradition of bipartisan support. From your various vantage points, what are the changes that you have noted in the politics around U.S. refugee admissions? How has it impacted policymaking? And how can each of us, from the executive and legislative branches, from civil society and the private sector, help support welcoming policies? Representative Crow, I'm going to ask you to answer that first, especially as it relates to the legislation you're introducing at the national level.
Yes, of course. Can you hear me, Nazanin?
Great, we can hear you really well.
Okay, great, wonderful. Sorry, we had technology issues on my side, so I wasn't able to join the webinar, but so good to be with you over the phone here. Thank you so much for the invitation to the States Lay the Foundation event, and thank you for your work, obviously, at the IRC. You do incredible work, and to my fellow panelists for the work that you all do in this space. You know, I take very seriously my status as a representative of one of the most diverse districts in the nation. We are a community of immigrants and refugees. Nearly 20% of my constituents were born outside of the country. And they're from all over. I have over 160 languages spoken in my largest school district, which is a testament to the diversity of our community. We are really a model in Colorado, and particularly in the 6th District, for how to get strength and vibrancy from our immigrant and refugee community. When we embrace refugees, when we embrace that immigration, and we welcome folks, and we invest in it, we get more vibrant businesses, a healthier economy, a more interesting, creative place to live and work. But that doesn't come without work. We have to make sure that we are investing in it, that we are establishing some basic services to help people understand and make that transition to America and to Colorado. We've been able to do that through natural helpers programs, through offices at the municipal and state level. Colorado just created a new Americans office very recently. We have made a decision to be deliberate and strategic about it. And as a result of that, I think we are doing a remarkable job in a model for the country. But you're right in that the approach to this has changed. And I think you realize the extent to which what our leaders say and do matters. And the unfortunate reality is the last 4 to 5 years, we have had leadership at the federal level that has attempted to divide us amongst ourselves, that has attempted to demonize or other our immigrants and refugees. And we've seen a rise in anti-immigrant crimes. We've seen a rise in anti-Asian sentiment in particular in Colorado. So it becomes much more important then for leaders to push back and to stand up and be vocal in opposition to that, and to say no, that the racism and the demonization is not true, that there's actually great strength to be had. So that's really what I view as a fundamental role as an elected official right now, is to be a very vocal and present advocate for our immigrants and refugees as a way to add great value to our community and to really be consistent with our values as a nation.
Thank you so much. Ms. Jackson, what would you add?
Well, first, thank you, Naz and Representative Crow and Cindy. It's great to be on this panel with you. I first want to just acknowledge all the work of the participants here today, because you all saw an opportunity where everybody else may have saw a terrible challenge, which is having refugees at the center of the political debate at the national level was a challenge. But at the state and local level, you saw it as an opportunity. You saw it as an opportunity to really tell the story at the state and local level about why refugee protection is really important and why refugee resettlement is important and how it reflects our values as a nation. And as a result of your hard work, you were able to build support and lay the groundwork for what I think is a really great, ambitious platform that the Biden administration has to re-energize and innovate on refugee resettlement. And we've been able to put that forward because you've created the space to do that. And it is an ambitious platform, and I think many of you know what's in store, but just to highlight a few things that I think reflect this partnership that we need with the state and local governments going forward to implement this platform. I would say to start with, we need to build on that longstanding state and local support that this program has always had, and we should never take for granted. I think that was clearly demonstrated in 2019 when we saw, in response to the executive order on state and local consent, we had the overwhelming majority of governors, whether they be Republican or Democrat, opt into this program publicly and in writing. And we need to build on that. And a way to do that is, for us, critically important that we have regular, close consultation and coordination with state and local partners, both at the federal level, but also with our resettlement agencies, whether that be formal consultations or, more importantly, even informal consultations. We need this dialogue to continue throughout the year, not just one, at the beginning of every fiscal year, to fully understand the challenges and the capacities that local communities have and how we can best support them in welcoming refugees. As we go forward, we want to expand community outreach and engagement in the coming years. We want to look at how to better leverage co-sponsorship programs that already exist And as I think many of you know, we are looking to launch a private sponsorship pilot program early in 2022. And I will end by just saying we're also looking at how we can expand more private sector and philanthropy partnerships, all as a means of trying to maintain support for this program.
Thank you so much. Couldn't agree more with both of our panelists' responses. Director Kwong, what would you add from your vantage point now and the work you've done to set up the Refugee Advocacy Lab?
Well, thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. Also, sorry, I had technical difficulties, but I'm just joining by phone, and it is a real honor. And I just want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, all the participants, Representative Crow and Nancy and you, Nazanin, for all the work that you've been doing. I think it is. I always just like to take a step back and say, looking at the past years, especially from the perspective of refugee resettlement, where the Biden administration came into office, in the wake of a really significant retreat from refugee protection, where the numbers of refugees who were admitted plummeted by more than 80%, and we saw more than 100 resettlement offices close. So it goes to what Representative Crow said. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's so many communities coming together, and Nancy mentioned this, whether it's the businesses, the faith groups, community-based organizations. One thing I really wanted to highlight, which comes from the work of the lab and IRC and the other partners, is the way that we saw refugees and immigrants really make huge contributions to the COVID response. And it was always so uplifting to speak with refugees who I know you've had speaking throughout the day, and just see how they're really at the forefront of community building and providing health and care and love and support to their neighbors. And I would just highlight a couple of things, just, in addition to that, the response to the executive order that Nancy mentioned, that we see so many instances where people come together, and I want to take my hat off to Representative Crow for the piece of legislation he's sponsoring with Representative Tacko on making sure that refugees and immigrants can make their maximum contribution in terms of their skill set and the economic role that they play in our communities. The final thing I wanted to flag is that, there are so many voices, echoing for a more welcoming communities. And I wanted to highlight that Secretary Becerra of HHS, Secretary Mayorkas at DHS, and Secretary Blinken at the State Department put together World Refugee Day messages. And it's really to that point that the messages from the top and setting an example and being a leader has ramifications throughout the United States, and it is this open hand to share in the leadership with states and localities. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Nancy, the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Management and the State Department in particular play such a unique role in bridging our global engagement on refugees and our domestic responsibilities in resettling refugees. There are currently over 26 million refugees worldwide, and we've traditionally played that significant role in addressing both overseas needs, including providing humanitarian aid and support for countries hosting large numbers of refugees, and protecting individuals and families through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. Can you talk about the relationship between these actions at home and how we address crises abroad, and how the program goals work together, and why it's so important to do both?
Absolutely, and it is such a great question, because I think it gets to the heart and soul of kind of PRM, my bureau's DNA. In our bureau, all we ever talk about are three things, which is protection, assistance, and solutions. And by solutions, I really mean durable solutions for refugees, of which, as I'm sure your participants know, are three. Hopefully, people can go home voluntarily in safety and dignity when conditions allow, or that they will be allowed to locally integrate in countries of first asylum. And when neither of those options are possible, we do look at third country resettlement, which is where our U.S. resettlement, refugee resettlement program fits in. So for PRM, all we ever talk about is protection, assistance, and solutions. And those three elements are so integrally linked, you can't do one without the other two. They just go hand in glove. And if you think about it, the overwhelmingly small percentage of refugees will actually ultimately benefit from third country resettlement. The majority of them will use the other two solutions. So right now, nearly 90% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries that are neighboring the sources of the conflict that caused refugees to flee. So the overwhelming burden, I hate to use that word because I don't like to think refugees as burdens, but the overwhelming challenge is really falling on the neighboring countries. And so we need to show solidarity as an international community to support these countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees. And it's critical to protection, that first pillar that I mentioned. We basically say to countries, if you do the right thing, if you keep your borders open, if you offer protection, if you allow people to seek asylum as they're fleeing for their lives, you will not have to do that alone. The international community will stand with you. We will provide immediate humanitarian assistance so that we can keep people alive and safe. And in the longer term, as these, unfortunately, situations continue to be increasingly protracted, decades long, we will look at third country resettlement to resettle the most vulnerable and to share that challenge with you. And so we leverage both our assistance and refugee resettlement as a means of actually getting to protection in the short and the long term. It preserves asylum space. It allows us as the international community to undergird and uphold the international norms and responsibilities under the Refugee Convention. It's burden sharing across the globe. It's the right thing to do. It reflects our values as a nation, but it actually does advance our foreign policy because we are looking at how to stabilize regions that have been, undergoing major shocks through conflict. And coming together as an international community, providing assistance, providing resettlement, allows us to work together as an international community and fundamentally uphold that undergirding principle, which is protection.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such an important reflection and part of the narrative that's not very well understood. I think if you're watching the news or asking, or checking in on sort of conventional wisdom, the vast assumption is that, nations like the U.S. host the vast majority of refugees when indeed, the vast majority are hosted in low and middle income countries. And Americans really look to see that kind of partnership. Are we, the U.S., carrying these burdens alone, or are we doing it in partnership? And this is a program where indeed, we're part of an international system with many other nations playing indeed like more significant roles even than the U.S., but where our partnership and leadership is so critical to upholding that international relationship and partnership. So thank you so much. It's an untold part of the story and so important to reach this audience. I wanted to switch gears again back to our domestic front, where over the past 5 years we've seen a wave of community support and increasing state-level policies to protect the resettlement program and ensure it remains intact. When we first started tracking state and local activity, it was in 2015 and 2016 when there were 19 states that introduced 53 pieces of anti-refugee legislation. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is a sea change at the state level, such that this year there were almost 80 bills introduced that benefited refugees related to issues such as workforce development and professional licensing, language access, standardizing enrollment procedures for refugee children, to name just a few. And by contrast, there were only 4 bills that were filed in states to restrict resettlement. So I really want to emphasize that's a ratio of 20-1 in favor of positive pro-refugee action. And I want to start with Representative Crow. Colorado has taken such a unique leadership role in welcoming refugees across all of the initiatives you mentioned in your opening. So I'd love for you to talk about how the momentum from your home state informs your positions in Congress and how that state level policymaking can be better represented at the federal level, and where federal policy can reflect the community and state level leadership and innovation that we're seeing. What are the approaches you'd love to see replicated at the federal level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Colorado has done a number of things. We have put into statute participation in the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. We provide in-state tuition for refugees and SIVs. We created, as I referenced earlier, a Colorado office for new Americans, and have done a lot of things at the municipal level as well in my district and in other districts. So we continue to focus on this, and we have benefited from it. We've absolutely benefited from it. We have a strong economy. We have a workforce that's growing, and we still are challenged like many states, but we certainly are able to meet the workforce needs in ways that other states can't because of our welcoming environment. But there's a lot of way to go here, and that's why I've joined with John Katko on the Improving Opportunities for New Americans Act, because unemployment and underemployment remains a challenge for certain segments of the immigrant refugee population. And it's not because they don't want to work, and it's not because the jobs aren't available. We have a large number of highly skilled, trained, and educated immigrants and refugees in the nursing professions, and teaching, and engineering, and health, and we have a lot of openings in those areas. So we actually have the ability to meet two problems at once. And that is reduce the underemployment challenges within the refugee population, but also meet substantial deficits in healthcare and teaching and engineering within our community that actually is a drag on our economic growth. So what our bill would do would require a study on factors that affect employment opportunities for immigrants and refugees, and look specifically at the issue of professional credentialing abroad and the transferability of those credentials to states and state regulatory agencies. It would have the Secretary of Labor coordinate with a wide variety of agencies to compile data on the licensure, the certifications, and to have the data necessary for the states to then utilize to make appropriate reforms. And then also look at an analysis of existing public and private resources that are available to immigrants and refugees in making that licensure transferability, so we can have a clearinghouse function to do this in a much better way. And I think if we are able to pass those and make those really pragmatic changes, we could meet some needs. We could grow our economy in states around the country and have a more vibrant business environment and just more vibrant communities all the way around.
Excellent, thank you. Cindy, from your vantage point with HHS and the policy opportunities and constraints, how do you think federal policymaking could better support community leadership and innovation? What changes at the federal level could support that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, we are looking at a range of models and are just very delighted. I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of the Biden administration's commitment to reach the goal of resettling 125,000 refugees per year, and it'll take some time to get there. But I think, in terms of what we're doing from ORR's perspective, we have increased our work around digital literacy, and that was something that many of us were forced to innovate around during COVID, but we've seen a lot of opportunities there, whether it's case management, building digital literacy skills, and ensuring that there's that there is muscle memory built so that we can continue to build on that. We are also, Nancy had mentioned, private sponsorship and increases in community sponsorship to really increase the connectivity that is already there, but that we can always build further on to create opportunities for citizens to come together and sponsor refugees to come here to the United States. A few other ideas. I do want to recognize that it's sometimes a diversity of models, and I was really pleased to hear all of the progress that's been made in California, whether it's in-state tuition, the offices of New Americans. I mean, these are all things that that we think will provide a lot of space for progress. And I think, from our side, we're also looking at a comprehensive review of resettlement funding levels, duration, and structure, because I know that predictability and that infrastructure is really critical for states to plan and to partner with us. And one angle of that, and that links to the economic opportunity that Representative Crow mentioned, is that, we're also looking at models where it's not necessarily measuring employment by how quickly refugees can get employed, but how we can make sure to invest in refugees, training, skill building, so that over their lifetimes, they make the maximum contribution possible. The last piece I wanted to mention is that from the federal side, we're looking into increasing the ways we can be data-driven in our decision-making. And so sometimes it's boring to talk about data, but those who know me know that I love it. So how are we collecting data and really analyzing it so that we can reach those longer-term outcomes and have a positive impact? So we are looking at performance-based refugee outcomes. People often say not counting the number of spoons or meetings, but really looking at the outcomes related to employment, self-sufficiency, and educational attainment. So those are some of the ways we're looking to push ourselves, again, so that we can be increasingly successful partners for our state and local champions.
Thank you. And Nancy, I wonder if you could also come in on this question, and as you answer, maybe lead us into the last question. With the changes you anticipate at the federal level, where do you hope to see the program in 10 years?
Oh, great. That's a really good question. So very quickly to answer the first part, with Cindy and her ORR colleagues, PRM really started the process in terms of figuring out what the program needed to be stronger, to be more innovative, and more inclusive. And we did that through listening tours, basically. We wanted to listen to the people and the communities that are resettling refugees and the refugees themselves. So ORR and PRM had a series of listening sessions with resettlement agencies, with state refugee coordinators, with think tanks. We read all the reports all of you wrote. And a lot of those ideas are what is reflected in the initiatives that you're seeing from the Biden administration. We have heard you and we are excited to now implement. I will point to a few things on our side that kind of go hand in glove, I think, with what you heard from Cindy in terms of ORR's changes. We are taking a hard look at our reception and placement program for FY 2022, and changes are coming in terms of restructuring how our affiliate funding model is structured to allow for more program stability at the local level. We know that's really important. We want to increase our focus on community engagement and sponsorships, as I mentioned before, including expanding co-sponsorship. We also want to think about how we can creatively promote innovation at the local level. We know that there's innovation that's needed at the federal level, but we also know that innovation is really going to need to be supported at the local level too, to respond to context-specific needs. And one of the challenges as we look across the program is housing. We know that with COVID and the pandemic, housing prices have risen. There's been a shortage of housing. There's been all kinds of housing issues that resettlement agencies have faced. So we are trying to figure out effective and innovative solutions to that challenge. So one of the things that we're considering is we intend to fund a housing technical assistance piece of the reception and placement program for 2022. We will also establish a pot of additional funding that will go directly to resettlement agencies' headquarters to be managed at headquarters level, that they can use that fund to supplement the RMP per capita grants based on what the local affiliates need to offset things like cost of living increases or housing. So we're trying to build flexibility and innovation even as we expand the program. Looking to the future, what would I hope for this program? So obviously, what the first thing I hope for is that we hit 125,000. We're very excited to grow the program. We want to see it change and strengthen, and we want to see innovation. But that's obviously going to take some time. There's a lot of moving pieces, as you, Nazanin, know better than anyone, but we're investing in all of those pieces. We're pushing UNHCR to build referral capacity, so where we start overseas. We're looking at expanding our resettlement support agencies so that they can process cases faster. We are talking to DHS about how to increase interviewing and screening by using new innovations like video teleconferencing, since COVID has really hampered their ability to travel. So we're looking at all of those things. And as I look to maybe 10 years out, what would I like to see? Well, I would like to see more actors and more communities responding to more needs. A real, truly expansion of this partnership at the state and local level. I would also hope that maybe we've adapted and are responding a little bit better to major challenges of our time, like climate change. I have to admit, we have a lot of thinking to do on what this means for us. I also hope that we're not the only resettlement country in town. As Nazanin and I had an exchange earlier, we seem to be the only country that's really talking about greatly expanding their resettlement program. And so one of our big to-dos coming up is to really have a big push in terms of international advocacy on behalf of global resettlement. And so in 10 years, I'd like to see other countries joining us and committing to expanding this unique form of protection. And to that, I want to thank David Miliband for his wonderful op-ed telling the EU they needed to join us. I thought that was really, really terrific, and we really appreciate it. And then I will end with one other thing, which is technology. How do we harness technology to kind of reimagine the resettlement process and maybe streamline it? And so how can we make it, using technology, make the resettlement more accessible, more equitably fair geographically? Can we think and move beyond our current model, which is, these large resettlement support agencies that are regionally focused with DHS flying all over the globe to interview people? Like, maybe there's a better way to use technology to do that and reach further into communities overseas to identify people that really need this unique form of protection and do it in a much more efficient way.
So a program, it's a wonderful vision, a program that is scaled, including globally, with many more countries also doing their part. A program, thinking about what Cindy shared, that's more responsive to both the needs and the opportunities of both refugees and their hosting communities. A program that creates, that is protected at the federal level, that replicates all the innovation that's happening at state and local levels, and makes welcoming communities a foundation of our returns, welcoming communities as a foundation with bipartisan support and the support of many, many, many Americans and local communities, as we know, demonstrated throughout this day. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, and thanks so much to our audience, begging your patience with additional time so we could hear from this amazing panel. With federal leadership and with this kind of vision in place, I'm so excited for where the program's going to be in 10 years. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.